Hi, it's the Blackboard Economist. Just in case you're wondering, the Blackboard Economist. And this is where I take the time to explain difficult concepts in economics. Some are more complex than others. Some are more extensive than others, but I take the time to explain them and I use my board. Econ is a very visual subject matter, so oftentimes we can allow students to appreciate the subject by just showing them a graph, analyzing, and giving them a sense of what things look like. Today, I want to take a minute to look at some macroeconomic concepts. And as I thought about this, I realized that macroeconomics, oftentimes you hear about inflation, unemployment, a recession, and these words kind of buzz around, and the Fed, and interest rate, and the stock market. But I want to contextualize things by looking at some perspectives of how the macroeconomy works. And how I want to do that is, I want to split it in two, okay? I want to look very broadly at what we refer to as classical economics and Keynesian economics. And as we think about this, I want you to kind of reflect to see what makes sense to you. How does the economy work? Okay? Now, when it comes to classical economics, usually where I start things in terms of the thought process is with an economist called Saw, and it's called Saw's Law. Now in econ, when you come up with a concept or theory, they call it a law, okay? And in this case, this was probably in the very early 19th century. We have an economist, Saw, and he came up with the idea that everything in the economy is predicted by supply. And I'm going to explain that. The idea here is supply is king or queen. The point is supply rules. And here's the thought process, because he was onto something. When you make and produce something, it's sold in the marketplace, it generates income. So let me say that again. When something is made and produced and sold in the marketplace, it generates income, okay? And when that generates income, people have money in their pockets. That money in their pocket, they then use it to go buy stuff. And when they buy stuff with that money, that stuff is back in the marketplace, generating even more income. So for Saw, the idea was, if we think about how the economy works, if we think about what generates what, it is the case where supply is the beginning. It's the production and the supply and the sale that causes businesses to do well. And without supply, we really don't have demand. So, in essence, supply creates demand. That's a pretty powerful statement, because basically, if you feel this is the case, according to the classical economists, who today are known as neoclassical, that's like the new classicals, if you want your economy to work, your focus should be on supply. If you really believe the classical economic theory of how the economy works, get everything to work in terms of making sure supply is as efficient as possible, making sure that production is free of any particular blockages, making sure the environment to produce, create, and supply is in fact one that allows for the expansion of production. And if that is the case, you make, produce, and sell, demand will follow. That's classical. Let's move over here where we have Keynes. Now, Keynes was a little bit different. Keynes argued, I don't really think that supply creates demand. And I'll give you some context as to why Keynes thought this, okay? And I'll just call this Keynes' law. As I said, if you come up with a theory or a concept, you get to call it a law. I'm still working very hard on the Blackboard law. It's not going so well, but I'm using the board here to explain some concepts, okay? So Keynes' law. Here's the context. Keynes is writing about how the economy works in the 1930s. And there's a big event in the 1930s you should know. That's the Great Depression. And what Keynes is observing at that time is nothing is really happening in the economy. In fact, things are really bad. We're going through a depression. Unemployment was over 20%, okay? If people had jobs, it was more so part-time work. There wasn't a lot of money flowing in the economy. We had the Black Monday, the Black Friday, where the stock market crashed. It was devastating. And what Keynes observed then is, he said, how is supply creating demand? Because nothing is happening with demand. And he kind of had a point. Because even though we're going through the Great Depression, okay, the capacity to produce was still there. Didn't we still have the factories? They were there. Didn't we still have the people, the labor force? They were there. Didn't we still have the technology that we had in the 1920s, the roaring 20s? It still existed. So the capacity to supply was still there. So if it's still there, why was it not creating demand? So Keynes said, hold on a minute. If the capacity to produce still exists and the economy stops, it might be the case where demand creates supply. And he kind of had a point. His argument is, your capacity to produce doesn't really mean anything unless people have the capacity to purchase and buy things. And it is that that spurs the economy. So if this doesn't exist, then you have a problem. So the demand creates supply was where Keynes got, and he argued, consumers are working. So for Keynes, demand ruled. And you have this school of thought called Keynesian economics, where how the economy works and the macroeconomy and movements in the productive capacity of society will in fact be determined by demand. And the idea behind Keynesian economics is if you want to spur the economy and move it, then your focus should be on demand. Unlike classicals and neoclassicals who say if you want to move the economy and you want to spur it and move it, your focus should be on supply. So the question is, who is right? What does it mean for policy? As you reflect in the comments, I want you to expand on what you probably think works. Some of this can be shaped in terms of your thought process, maybe because of your political ideology might shape some of this. Now, I argue that at the end of the day, the hot issue here is both of these are correct. It really depends on where exactly you are in the economy. Excuse me, when I say where exactly you are, I mean, are we looking at the short run, or are we looking at how the economy moves over time and end up in the long run? Because that matters. fluctuations in the macroeconomy, the shocks, the recessions, those can be explained by demand issues. But over time, where the economy ends up is really dictated in terms of your potential from your capacity to produce. So any policy that focuses on just one and not the other is in fact flawed. It has to be the case where there's a combination of the supply and demand issues to figure out how to get the macroeconomy to move. That's what I think. Now, some people might lean more towards Keynesian economics, given a particular time period or issue, and some people might lean more towards the classical or neoclassical, given a particular issue or macroeconomic instability. The point is, the hot news item is, it has to be the case where policy is determined by a combination of these factors. I hope my use of the board when we think about macroeconomic ideology and theory, just giving you a simple view using my board here. Until next time, take care.